This world that is so centered in medicine and therapy teaches that if you are suffering, it means something is wrong with you. The biblical perspective actually teaches something pretty similar. But like most worldly wisdom versus biblical wisdom, the worldly wisdom is just a little out of focus. And if we want to put it back in focus, we first need to take a step back. If you haven't read your text yet, I want you to go ahead and pause this video right here. Go to Romans chapter 5, 1 through 5. We need to talk about the relationship between suffering and hope. If we're going to have a full picture of what hope is and how we develop hope in our life, then we need to really talk about suffering. I know it's not something we want to talk about, but we can have a conversation that's different now because we've done a broader perspective on hope in this world. Remember, in the first chapter, we talked about having a living hope because Jesus Christ has been resurrected from the grave. In his resurrection, we now have a living hope. And then in the second lesson, we talked about it's cosmic hope. It's not just that God is doing something in my individual life, but God is doing something grand in all of creation. All of the cosmos is hoping to be resurrected like Jesus is resurrected. And the resurrected Son is in fact holding all of the things of this world together. So my faith isn't just about me. My hope isn't just that someday I get to go to heaven, but rather that God is going to recreate the whole world and I will have a part and a role and a place in that narrative. And then last week we talked about all that Christ is doing in this world, all that he has promised to do, and all that God is going to do through him in the days to come is already beginning to take place in me. That is Christ in you, the hope of glory. So that guides our discussion on suffering too. And here's the problem. For most of us, we have this individualized faith that we've talked about. And so when it comes to suffering, we're left with two conclusions. If I'm suffering and I have this individualized faith, which means that everything Christ did and everything God did, he did just for me, in hoping that I would make the right choice and someday ascend and be with him in heaven. So if it's all really about me and this individualized faith, then when I come to suffering, I'm left with two conclusions. One is God is punishing me for sin in my life. Or two, God is disciplining me to make me a better disciple. That's a hard place to be in, especially if you've really suffered. You ever been in the moments of true suffering? And you're left with those two choices. And so I've seen so many people that are faith-oriented and are growing and developing faith, but live their whole life so faithful, and they're left just questioning, who is God? Why could he let this happen? Why would he do this to me? There's some that even contend that since we've created such a highly individualized faith, that when we're confronted with suffering and we don't see a God who is compatible with the one who punishes and disciplines, we're left to just not believe that God exists at all. That's why I see so many people that are raised in Christian ways, raised in Christian living, and they honor so many pieces of that in their Christian life, but when confronted with real suffering, they choose to believe that God no longer exists. We need a bigger perspective when we talk about suffering. And if we're going to understand hope, we have to have that bigger perspective. But we've set the table, haven't we? We've been able to put things in the right perspective so we can put the questions of suffering in focus. See, in fact, the truth is that when we suffer, there is something wrong. But it's not necessarily something just wrong with you. As we've talked about, the whole creation yearns in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. It's in pains of childbirth right up until now. See, the whole world is suffering. It's suffering because this isn't the way God intended it. He didn't want it like this. Sin has broken into the boundaries of God's good creation and is creating chaos and pain and hurt within that boundary. So when we suffer, we recognize that we suffer because we live in a broken world. And we aren't the only ones that suffer. The creation suffers. Our friends and our family, they suffer. There's not necessarily this direct link between my personal moral character and the suffering I'm undergoing. The Old Testament scholar Terence Fretheim, he refers to it as a loose causal weave. You can imagine a woven basket is what he contends. And if you pull on one of those weaves of the basket, you see things move around the basket. But just pulling directly on this doesn't mean it directly causes something that happens over here. So when we undergo suffering, we do say there's something wrong, there's something not right. And in fact, there's a sense in which my moral responsibility, my moral failings has led to the brokenness and the sinfulness in this world that causes suffering and pain. But that's not a direct link. And I want you to know today, if you are in the pains of suffering, if you're dealing with hurt, it's not God punishing you for some moral failure. Instead, it should be pointing you to the hope of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because when we see suffering in this huge perspective that it's in, we realize it's a pointer that says this world isn't right now, but someday it will be. Someday it will be. Paul talks about this, right? In chapter 5, verse 2. We boast. I'm going to go kind of Bible dork on you a little bit today and talk about a few Greek words here. This is kaxomai. It's a word that literally means to speak loudly, not to brag necessarily, but it's to speak loudly without shame. So it's to boast is a good term. And Paul says, we boast in hope. We boast in hope of the glory. Oh, our word from last week. Do you remember our word glory? Doxa. It's the Hebrew term kavod. And we boast in our glory, like our radiant being. No, we boast in our honor. We boast in the integrity of God. But we don't boast in that. We boast in the hope of that. Because we have a different hope than the world around us. So we speak loudly that our character and our quality is based on what God is going to do in all of creation. So we boast in that. All right? And then he says, this is where the NIV just misses this in the translation. They say, not only so, but we also, they translate this word as glory. Guess what? It's the same word as boast in verse 2. It's kaxomai too. And the word, again, is boast. So Paul is paralleling two concepts. On the one hand, we boast in the hope of the glory of God, but not only this, but we also boast in our suffering. How could we possibly boast in suffering? Well, he goes on to say, it's because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Now I want to pause for just a second on this word character. This word, the stem of this word character, is the same stem as the word for doxa, glory. Okay, so these are related. Now, they're distant cousins, right? They're not directly related, but the idea is similar. This is a word about your quality or your character, okay? And it's also, this is important, this word doesn't really exist in the New Testament until Paul's writings. And every time Paul uses it, it's in a communal sense. It's about the community of God, okay? So it's the whole character of the community of God's people, which changes how we read this. Why? Because we don't have an individualized faith. We have a cosmic faith. We're involved in something so grand. Remember, just a few chapters later in Romans 8 is that beautiful description of all creation. So here we think about suffering as a people. We talk about perseverance, and then we have this character. And when we have character, it finally develops hope. I want to leave you with 3 points, just kind of talking points as we go today. The first is this. In Paul's great trifecta of the Christian way of walking with Christ, there is 3 virtues: faith, hope, and love. We all believe that we grow in faith as we get older and older, right? We mature in the faith. We grow in faith. And I think we all understand, too, that we mature in love. We grow in love just like a married couple grows in their love towards one another. We as a church grow in our love towards one another. But why is it when we get to hope that we don't think it's possible for us to grow in hope, too? We think hope is just like this thing that we have. Either we have it or we don't. We cling to it or we don't have it. But actually what Paul is saying is that hope is something we grow in as we grow older. Well, how then? You want to say, how do we grow in hope? Well, that's the next 2 points I want to make here is Paul says we grow in hope through suffering. Because suffering does something. I want to talk about two movements that are really important as we end here. These are my last 2 points. Okay. First, when we are confronted with suffering, we need to do two things if we want to grow into hope. The first is we need to move from isolation to community. Most people, when they undergo suffering, right, like they want to be alone or they isolate themselves. I've seen so many people that when they're facing the hardest times in their life, they go and they be by themselves and they hurt by themselves. And husbands, men in the faith, how many of you, the only time you've cried or you've expressed your pain and your suffering is when you were by yourself? But Paul contends suffering, when done in a healthy, hopeful way, if you want your suffering to produce character and perseverance that develops hope, you do it in the community of believers. You trust others around you to build you up, to push you forward, to help you hope, right? And that leaves me with the final point. This is the hardest one. In suffering, you can either turn towards despair or hope. It's really your choice. I hope you choose the way of hope.